interview going up, but
oh no, that's no. I wanted it was this one that.
Is it possible for you to put it on the...
Come up, Francis, on anything.
We are
Pigeon
live.
Post or whatever works.
Yeah.
We can just tell them what they are, and then I guess Steve, because he's got a faster speed, can type the answers.
Now, it's the first interview.
Right, I think
but
just. Oh no, that's the no. I wanted it was this one that.
Come up, Francis, on anything.
We are
Pigeon
live.
Post or whatever works.
yeah.
We can just tell them what they are.
Where's that
Then
coming?
I guess Steve, because he's got a faster speed, can type the answers.
Now, it's the first interview.
Right, I think
but
just. That's better.
Okay.
I've just put the link in there. Steve, can you post that link that's in the chat onto Facebook now? Yeah.
Okay, guys. It looks like we're waiting for live, and we've got various people here waiting to give you answers. We decided to do it live via various links tonight, and I think there's an awful lot of people on Facebook and YouTube. So if you're getting any of this, we are getting to you. So keep the questions rolling in, and we will get to them. Mark, I'm now live on YouTube according to my screen. Is that right? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you now, guys. Thank you for hanging in there with us. I hope you enjoyed the show, and it's sort of given you some comfort at what is a difficult time. It was a show that we really loved making, and for all of us watching it again, brought back so many memories, as you can imagine. We've got Helen with us tonight, Helen Geek, which is lovely, and we'll be answering those questions as soon as possible. While waiting, a few parish notices. We're going to stop virtually after we started. We're going to stop about 10 to 8, so you can have a cup of tea and watch the Queen. Ever since she let us dig up her back garden, we've always had a certain amount of affection for her on Time Team. Uploads tonight will include 2 great interviews with Carenza and Helen, and an audio interview with Stuart. Next Sunday is Easter Sunday, and what we're going to do there is play you some more of the wonderful conference that we had recently, some of the members of Time Team, and us talking about the legacy and the future. We also would like you, if possible, to bake a cake. As it's Easter Sunday, we'd like some cake baking done and send a pic in, and we are going to be giving some prizes out, which include some of these wonderful books by Victor, signed by him, and some Time Team Dig Village books. So if you send some pics in, we'll judge it on Sunday. Maybe we can get Sandy Tosvig to judge it. She did some lives with Time Team, was absolutely fantastic. And I understand somebody called Thatcher Joe decided he wanted to be an archaeologist and has got ahead of us, really. So you might like to look at that. Okay, so we're waiting for questions, and I'm hoping that they're going to be coming up at some point. But as I've got Helen here, Helen, can you tell me approximately the date of our burials there, and who was the Saxon king or queen, or who was in charge at the time of the people we found in the garden?
Yes, well, one thing that I didn't know all the way through filming, because Paul didn't tell me and I didn't find out till I watched the programme, was that he'd independently dated the pot that was found with Henry at the beginning of the programme, and that caused me a bit of stress, because I thought, oh no, what happens if it's a completely wrong date, you know? But he dated that to the late 6th to 7th century. The rest of Henry was 7th century, all his grave goods, and the lady we found was again 7th century. you can't date them very narrowly within that. And so there could have been any of many kings on the throne of whichever kingdom Raunds was in, because it probably oscillated between Mercia and East Anglia. But the best candidate really is Penda, the fantastic last of the pagan kings, the mighty king of Mercia, who rampaged all over the country, killing other kings, setting fire to things, fighting incredible battles. He's the most exciting Anglo-Saxon king of them all, so I'll vote for him being Henry and his friends king.
And you look, I'm not sure how old you are, if that's not a rude question, but you look, it would look like it was an early time team for you. And you arrived, what was it like arriving on a time team for the first time?
It's very peculiar because it's both terrifyingly strange and incredibly familiar, because you know who all these people are and you know what is going to happen, you know what's going on, and yet none of the people know you, and you have never seen behind the scenes before. But what was wonderful was that I felt incredibly welcomed, particularly by Carenza, who was incredibly solicitous and kept shepherding me around everywhere, and Stuart, who was always checking that I was all right, which was really lovely. So it was an odd mix of the strange and the familiar, but I did slot in very well. I felt very comfy.
And we've got a question from David, and he asks, which find that we made on that episode was the rarest, the most unusual find? And he would like to know, are we talking about Angles here, Anglo-Saxons, or something else? So what was the rarest find to you, or the most exceptional? Well, if you're going to be pedantic and say that we had to find it, that would be a bit harder. But the most exceptional find from Patton Morris's back garden was that buckle plate with the holes in it. I've never seen anything quite like that, and it may be because others that have been found haven't been x-rayed. But it in iron, it's very unusual. It's a little like some silver and bronze ones, but it's quite an extraordinary and individual piece that you can almost see that it's individually made by a single craftsman. And the person we found, the people we found, would these have been first, second generation Anglo-Saxons, or British that had mixed with the Anglo-Saxons? Well, they would have thought of themselves as Angles, and I think that's probably because their king was an Angle. So they had allegiance to their king and their lord, and they were Angles. Angles come from Angeln in Germany, which really, rather extraordinarily, is the angle between the peninsula that makes Denmark and the mass of Germany. And the word angle does mean angle. They come from the angle. But what's likely is that it was just a king or a lord that came from there, and that the ordinary people were just the descendants of the Romano-British who'd always lived there, who are the descendants of the Iron Age, who are the descendants of the Bronze Age people, and so on. About maybe 10% of people might have come from Germany in ships, not very many. And we were talking last time with you, one or two people have said, you know, how do we now tell in modern science where these people actually came from? Because we've got all sorts of oxygen isotope and things like that. Is it possible that we've got, you know, you and me and 23 or whatever it's called nowadays, if we had that now on Time Team, could you take some material from the teeth and find out where they came from? You could get some of the way. The isotopes is a tricky one, because although in theory you can look at isotopes from teeth, say, and discover where somebody lived up until the time that they were 6 and their teeth stopped forming or whatever, that in theory works, but we don't have a decent base map. It wouldn't cost very much to make a good base map of the whole of Europe, but at the moment, if you look at the base map that's used, the contour lines are so broad that you don't know whether someone's coming from Wales or Denmark, really. And so it's not as good as you'd think. The DNA
there is a difference between people from Germany and people from England. I don't know if you remember, but we did get Phil's DNA done, his Y chromosome and his mitochondrial DNA. And I think we all expected him, you know, he was the Wessex man. We all thought that being from Wessex, he would be Germanic in origin, and those two scraps of his DNA. But in fact, he was 100% caveman. he was descended from the prehistoric inhabitants of Britain, which I think made him just as happy.
The dog. Lots of people will have seen when they're watching the programme Victor's wonderful picture of the dog at the feet. And initially we didn't know it was a dog, but how rare is it for in Anglo-Saxon burials to have somebody who is buried with what looks like a pet, and what's that doing there?
Well, it's incredibly rare. I only know of two others, both from the 7th century. But you see, my expertise is in 7th century burials. There may be some 5th and 6th century ones out there, but no one has ever, to my knowledge, done any research on them. So the two I know about is that there's a boy, I think, buried with or a young man buried with a crow or some other kind of corvid, so something like a jackdaw or something. No one quite knows whether that's a pet or not. And then from about 30 or 40 miles away from our site at Raunds, there's a site in Cambridgeshire called Barrington, and a dog was found there in the edge, kind of disturbed in the edge of a bed burial, a 7th century bed burial. But if you look it up in the report, no one's terribly interested. No one's wondering what this means. But it is the inclusion of animals is a long-standing thing in Anglo-Saxon cremation burials, and that has been studied. And the weird thing is that the only correlation that you can find is that children in cremation burials are more often found with sheep. Now, how do you explain that? Sheep aren't pets. It's not only children that eat lamb. You know, what is going on? We need someone to take this and do something with it. We need to know more.
And we've had a question from Sarah Mackay, I think it is. And she was interested in, is it unusual to find someone that age in Anglo-Saxon? Because he was about 60, wasn't he?
Yes, well, the only way that we could have got that information was from a forensic dentist. If we'd got a standard bones person like Alice Roberts or Margaret Cox or somebody to tell us how old they were, they would simply have said over 45, because that's all we ever can do from bones. And it's a fine judgment. It's to do with teeth wear and all sorts of things. But it's interesting that as bone specialists get to 45, they start to think, hang on, I want to know more about this. This person I'm now the old person, and surely I don't feel old. There must be more gradations. So dentists got involved quite a few decades ago with the Spitalfields excavation, where we had coffin plates, so we knew exactly how old people were. This is the Spitalfields 18th, 19th century churchyard. And the dentists did, the research that the dentists did could match the date. The research the archaeologists did could not match the age. So it's still only dentists that can tell us how old. Now, you don't often get a dentist working on the material, and therefore we still don't have very many of these older individuals, but that's not because they're not old, it's because we don't have enough dentists to work with us. It seems like if you survived childhood illnesses and you survived childbirth, if you're a woman, and you survived possibly those accidents and deaths in battle that happen when you're a young man, you could go on for really quite a long time. And 60 wouldn't necessarily have been old.
I think one of the questions a couple of people have asked is, Pat was so excited about what she'd found, and I think they were trying to put a koi carp pond in. We occasionally got requests from people to dig holes in their garden, and I sometimes think it was to, you know, enable them to have a bit of a pond with some fish in. But she had a burial that was sort of in the way of the pond. And I think the idea she had was maybe to sort of do it as carefully as possible and then move it out the way. I think probably both of us would say it's the sort of thing that's not really recommended. It's quite a job to dig a burial, and there's always the chance that you may miss some details and things like that. So although in Pat's case, she probably had to do something, otherwise it would have been damaged by whoever was putting the koi carp pool in. The actual process of doing a skeleton is a very tricky job to do. And when you watch the way Phil digs, would you like to comment on the whole process of actually what it takes to dig a skeleton and get the most out of it properly?
Well, I think that you saw Phil digging the silver ring necklace on the female skeleton, and that shows how important it is to be doing everything minutely carefully. The rings tend to be tied together with thread. Sometimes it's silk thread, which is interesting. Where does the silk come from? Probably China. Sometimes they're interlinked, that's very rare. Sometimes they have beads strung on them. They're all different. And if you don't excavate them incredibly carefully, you don't know. And another thing is, of course, we had stains on Henry's bones, and we don't know what had caused those stains. And if somebody knew what they were doing, they might have been keeping an eye out for the likely grave goods that would have been in likely places. So that's about the grave goods. About the skeleton, there can be tiny little things that are not noticed by inexperienced excavators. And the one that Margaret Cox always used to go on about is the pubic symphysis. That you can tell from that it has muscle attachments, and you might be able to tell from that, if it was preserved, roughly how many children a woman had. But it's the highest bit of the pelvis, and it's always knocked off, according to Margaret, because people don't know not to.
It was the cause of a particularly memorable Time Team incident on the live programme in York, where the cameras rolled towards Phil, who was in the trench with Margaret, and he kept saying, "Margaret, what's the name of that thing?" And she kept saying, "Pubic tubercle, pubic." And when it got to Phil, Phil said, "Here, Margaret, I think we've got a tubic pubicle down here." Yes. So Anglo-Saxon England, you said to me the other day, this was the start of us becoming English. And what sort of period do you feel that we are now, think of ourselves as Anglo-Saxon? When did that time period occur? How long was it, that process of becoming Anglo-Saxon, then becoming English, really, approximately speaking?
Well, becoming Anglo-Saxon was very quick. You start off the 5th century, 400 AD, still in the Roman world. Everything is functioning pretty well in the late Roman system. And by the time you get to about 480, 80 years later, you're into Anglo-Saxon England. And it happens almost overnight in archaeological terms. And that's why it's so mysterious and extraordinary and so exciting and interesting. So people don't believe that they don't identify as British or Roman anymore. They identify as Anglian or Saxon or Kentish or East Anglian or Mercian or whatever. But the Anglo-Saxon period then carries on to, well, officially it ends in 1066 with the Norman conquest. So it's as long as from Elizabeth I to our times, really. It's centuries and centuries and centuries. And all that time is spent becoming English, because at first you've got people in their different kingdoms. So you've got the Mercians and the East Anglians and so on and so forth. And then it's been likened to the FA Cup knockout stage, when kingdoms fight each other and one wins and the other one disappears. So East Anglia disappears, and Sussex, the South Saxons, they disappear, and Essex disappears, and so on and so forth. And then also, of course, we get the cataclysm of the Vikings, and that destroys or changes everything. And the kings, starting with Alfred the Great, who fight back against the Vikings, they're not fighting just for Wessex. They're fighting to turn in for the House of Wessex to rule the whole of England and for it to become Angleland, England. And that takes another up until about 950. And so you've only got England for about 100 years before the Norman conquest comes along. So it takes absolutely ages to turn Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into England.
And am I right in thinking it's Athelstan? People always think of Alfred the Great, but really when Alfred was alive, we still had the North, we still had Mercia to an extent, but it was the defeat by Athelstan of the Northumbrians in 967 or something that was the point at which you could say Athelstan was probably the first real king of England.
Yes, Alfred starts the process, and then his son Edward the Elder carries it on, and Athelstan is well placed to take over when it's all pretty much almost done. So I don't know how much is because Athelstan was so great, or how much he was in the right place at the right time. But yes, we should remember Athelstan much more than we do, and Edward the Elder.
And it was very nice to see you in your own territory, if you like. Over the years, you've done quite a lot of Anglo-Saxon burials with Time Team. And what I often get asked is, what is the most precious and interesting Anglo-Saxon object that you have discovered or has been discovered in Time Team for you? If you were doing Time Team in 50 objects, which object rings a bell?
A single object is difficult because the thing that is just so extraordinary and blows everything else out of the water was that series of buckets that we found at Bremer. They were just unparalleled. I mean, in their grouping, you know, we had 12 buckets. You'd have to dig 12 Anglo-Saxon cemeteries normally to have 12 buckets. They were just mind-blowing, and we still don't know what was going on there. We know that buckets, or we believe that buckets are something to do with drink, probably alcoholic drink. But what was going on in that sleepy Hampshire village that meant that every single one of them had three buckets stacked together in their graves? And that was just extraordinary.
And I seem to remember some previous conversations we had where you somewhat perversely decided to go for a loom weight or something because you thought that was fantastic. Why?
Well, I'm afraid the longer you spend working in archaeology, the more you can get away from the real people that were alive in the past and who make the whole subject interesting. And I'm afraid over the years, I have in some ways got to see objects as tools, and I like an object that allows me to date something, an object that acts like a key to unlock all sorts of other bits of data that I didn't have before. Occasionally you make a find and you think, finally, that has made the whole jigsaw puzzle come to life. And so it was with this little lead spindle well, actually, to help you spin from Codnor Castle. It's still the only relief decorated lead spindle well found in an archaeological context. We've got hundreds of these things found all over the country, and we can't date the sites, or we couldn't date the sites on which they were found. And then that one, well, it shows us that they're medieval, and they're all very similar, so they're all the same date. So we now know that they're not Roman, they're not Iron Age, they're not 18th century, and these things had all been suggested. We know that they are. We now know that they are medieval, and that was Codnor Castle Moat that showed us that.
And we're going to head towards a break in a moment because we're all going to stop, have a cup of tea, and watch Her Majesty the Queen. So we've got an extraordinary set of drawings from that shoot. And I wonder what Victor's pictures at the end of the day meant to you. What do those pictures do as part of Time Team? He was a central part of Time Team for so much time. And hopefully during the break, we'll put up some of those pictures so people can look at them in detail. But what is it that Victor brings to a Time Team?
Well, I'm always banging on about the intellectual process of making a reconstruction drawing. It forces you to make decisions. You can't leave anything fuzzy. But it's more than that for Victor's drawings, because they really remind you about the humanity. Every grave is a little tragedy. Every cemetery is a collection of a community's tragedies and difficult moments. And sometimes it's easy to see them as just bits of data, you know, a find here, a leg that way, a person on their front or their back, or with their head to the north or the west. But Victor makes you remember that these were live people. These were real people who chose clothes and had certain sized feet and wanted to look pretty, or wanted to look imposing, or had their hair a particular way, or had a favorite dog. And it's so easy to forget that, and Victor makes you remember it.
And that episode, I think, was extraordinary because of all the things it brought together. And I know Raunds is part of a much bigger picture. There's a lot of work been done at Raunds, and perhaps after the break, we'll talk a little bit about the context, the bigger context, and hopefully answer some more questions. So, guys, we're going to take a break now, have a cup of tea, watch the Queen, try and screw together YouTube and Facebook and all the various things. Thank you very much for sending questions in. Helen and I could carry on chatting all night about this, so for goodness sake, send some questions in, and we'll be seeing you about 10:15, I think we're saying, and hopefully everything will be working. So thank you, Helen. And
15 minutes.
8:15 we'll be back
8:15.
again. Yeah.
I'll
Okay.
switch the light on.
Thank you very much.